Number 7 from L. Sloggle, who says, Pastor Mike, hi. Why didn't Luke mention the time gap that took place during Acts 9, 20 through 26 that Paul mentioned in Galatians 1, 17 through 18? Thanks for the answers. This is a tough issue because we're guessing at the motives that writers may have had for not including time gaps. Okay, so let me just preface it with this, and I won't get into all the details, but I'll mention, okay, actually, let me just do it this way. Galatians 1, we'll start with that because that'll be the easier passage to wrap our heads around. Paul talks about after he got saved. He says that he did not immediately consult with anyone. That means the apostles. In the context, he's talking about the apostles. He doesn't mean he didn't talk to anybody, because he obviously talked to Christians, but not the apostles. He didn't go to Jerusalem to talk to the apostles, but he went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Then after 3 years, he goes up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, and it's kind of a private thing where he talks to Peter and James. Then later on, when there's a debate, he goes back to Jerusalem again. And your thought is, in Acts 9... Let's look at that passage now. Verse 20 through 26. Why doesn't Luke talk about this? How did I get to Acts 28? Let's try that again. 9:20. Okay. So this is after Paul gets saved. He says, for some days he was with the disciples at Damascus. And immediately he proclaimed Jesus in the synagogues, saying, he is the Son of God. And all who heard him were amazed and said, is not this the man who made havoc in Jerusalem of those who called upon this name? Wasn't he persecuting them first? And has he not come here for this purpose to bring them bound before the chief priests? But Saul increased all the more in strength and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Christ. He was doing some prophetic apologetics. Let me just point that out. Verse 23, when many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, but their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night in order to kill him. But his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. And when he had come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, and they were not all afraid of him. They were all afraid of him, excuse me. And then Barnabas and all this other stuff. But let's just say this, like Acts 9, before I get into why doesn't he include more details like Galatians has a couple different things here. First off, I'll say they seem to harmonize well, okay? He stays in Damascus for some time. He's proclaiming Jesus. And then he has this moment where in Acts he says, he increased in strength. He confounds the Jews who live in Damascus. He proves that Jesus is the Christ. Then they plot to kill him. And here's the transition. They took him by night, let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. Period. And when he had come to Jerusalem. Okay, so it doesn't say in Acts 9 that he went directly to Jerusalem. He didn't go anywhere else. It doesn't say that in Damascus, he didn't have a hub in Damascus and then preach in other locations and come back to Damascus. It doesn't tell us a lot of things. There's lots of room here for a variety of other things to happen in the Apostle Paul's life. There's just and here's another episode in the life of Paul. And when he had come to Jerusalem, this is what happened. Now let me come back to the question. So in other words, there's lots of holes where all sorts of things could happen in the book of Acts that he didn't talk about, Luke didn't talk about. But now let me come to your question. Why didn't Luke more carefully align his data with the same stuff that Paul's saying in Galatians 1? And I think the answer here is simple. Luke is writing, I think Acts has 15 years worth of content in 28 chapters. 15 years in 28 chapters. Here's a challenge for you. Summarize 15 years of your life and do it with only the space that Luke has in the book of Acts, 28 chapters. Go for it. Summarize 15 years. You will find that exactly like Luke, you have tons of places where you could later tell a story and it would have happened in between this chapter and that chapter, and you didn't have time or space to mention it, but it wasn't super relevant. In Acts 9, he just wants to say Paul got saved, and then he started preaching the gospel, And then he eventually, and they persecuted him. They're turned against him, but he was proving that Jesus was the Christ. And then he comes to Jerusalem and he's got conflict with the apostles because they're scared. They don't know that they can trust him. I think that we have to realize every story section in the New Testament is summarizing very large portions in very small spaces. And so there's going to be lots of room for all kinds of other events that happen. John admits this at the end of his gospel, where he's like, hey, Jesus did so many other things. I picked these of all that happened, to instill faith in you, to encourage you. But there's so much more Jesus did. I think it makes a lot of sense.